Hello. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Massachusetts. For those of you who are coming from other places, my name is Greg Nadeau, and I do live here in Somerville, Massachusetts. My background is I was the CIO of the Massachusetts Department of Education, and I now work for Public Consulting Group, where I do education data projects, principally with states. And it's my pleasure here to introduce the three panelists who are each going to go through around 8 to 10 minutes of their research, and then we're going to have some questions. I asked them all to think about the three questions as they do their presentations. What data matters to them and why? What are the barriers and best practices to accessing that data? And what do they see as the future trends happening with this type of data? And with that, I'll start with Matthew. Matthew is an assistant professor of education, leadership, and policy at Florida State University. And I'll leave it to you.
So I guess we sit. Oh, yeah, it's mirrored. Okay, cool. Let's do that. Get my slide up. Okay, well, it's great to be here. It's wonderful always to be on a panel with Shaun and Celeste, who can forget more about CTE than I'll ever know. They're really leaders in the field, so you can listen to me, but definitely listen to them as well. I'm going to do something a little different than present just straight research. I'm going to introduce a typology of thinking about evidence in CTE that Shaun and his colleagues actually gave us through a really important meta-analysis in CTE research. And then I'm going to try to think through where in the state of Florida, which is where I am now, we might also think about fitting policy-driven CTE interventions and programs into these buckets, these evidence-based buckets. So, as I mentioned, Shaun and Jim Lindsay and others, through a really important CTE network in the United States, did this meta-analysis where they thought about CTE evidence in 4 distinct buckets. And those are small learning communities, whole school models, returns to concentration and pathway completion, and then other CTE delivery. And what's really nice about this typology is there's so little evidence about CTE effectiveness in the United States, and many studies stand alone, some are causal, some are descriptive, and what Shaun and his team did was they basically said, let's find all the highest quality causal studies we can find and condense all of the findings into simple numbers that can help explain how effective CTE in the United States is. And so small learning communities, what they found was relatively small effects overall, and these are what we would call career academies, for instance. Whole school models use pathways at the entire high school level. They also found small effects there. Return to concentration had the largest effects overall, and that pretty much means, are you concentrating in CTE as a high schooler? Are you taking a series of courses that are in a CTE pathway? And to what extent is that boosting your post-secondary enrollment or earnings? And they found fairly large effects on the economic dimension. And then other CTE delivery is what we might think of as certifications, apprenticeships, internships, and all 3 of those, and dual enrollment and others, they sort of intersect across 1 through 3. And so you can imagine a world in which a career academy is providing students with career pathways that lead to an industry certification and perhaps allow them to get articulated credit at a community college. So a lot of this stuff is related, but I think heuristically for us to think about CTE in state and district contexts, we should try to put it in buckets so that we can describe to the public and to stakeholders and to people who care about this what are the most effective policies and programs that we have. So Florida's CTE landscape, it really kicked off in 2007 with the Career and Professional Education Act. This act had a few components. Basically, the idea was to work with the broader business community in order to develop high-quality, high-value pathways, which industry certification for Florida was and remains a very big deal and something the state promotes pretty aggressively. Later on, the gold standard career pathways, which were part of CAPE, promoted articulated course credit towards associate degrees. And then more recently, the governor has begun to talk about CTE as a potential mechanism for making Florida the #1 state to attract workforce talent. And then finally, the REACH Act was super important for trying to figure out what industry certifications, for instance, would lead to articulated credit and be considered high value or in demand. And so this is kind of the through line through which I've been thinking about policy and CTE policy in particular in Florida. So with career academies, we actually know quite a bit about them based on a landmark study from MDRC quite some time ago where we saw large increases in earnings, but really not much else. More recent work that I've co-authored with colleagues, we found pretty substantial high school and college going effects, but in the aggregate, we have a lot more to learn. Florida has quite possibly the largest number of career academies in the United States, upwards of 2,000 across middle school and high school. And in particular, they have these NAF academies, which are what we might call distinguished academies, and it has the most in the nation, and it also has the highest enrollment among all states for NAF academies. So we think that for small learning community evidence, this is a really nice place to start, thinking about how we can scale and measure and think about career academies in Florida and beyond. Finance happens to be the most popular NAF academy theme. And then so whole school models, number 2, Shaun has actually done extensive work on whole school models in Massachusetts, and he found significant impacts on high school completion, but there's a lot more we don't know about post-secondary and labor market outcomes. Florida, there isn't a whole lot to say about whole school models, except for the fact that there have been some vocational schools in the past, and now we actually have post-secondary charter authorizers looking back and working and leading the effort to convert certain vocational high schools into charters. So in the school choice mechanism, that seems to be where we're going. Returns to CTE coursework are perhaps the most promising way to think about the benefits of CTE coursework. We tend to see large effects across the board in both high school, college, and the workforce. Some authors, one of which is a colleague of mine at Florida State University, now led a study to examine the effects of coursework returns on income and a variety of other outcomes, and that was issued to the U.S. Congress about, 15, 20 years ago now. In Florida, the state is definitely interested in pathways, in particular post-secondary achievement as opposed to attainment. So to what extent does high school CTE affect your achievement, your course completion, your course grades, your progress toward degree in college? Florida's also interested in middle school. They really want to reach back and figure out, can we start a CTE pathway in middle school? Can we tie it to high school? And to what extent can we think about that entire trajectory into college and the workforce? And then Florida also has these articulation agreements where, as I mentioned earlier, pathways lead to an industry certification, and then an industry certification can lead to college credit, especially in community colleges. And then finally, bucket 4 was other delivery, and really in Florida, this is dominated by industry-recognized certifications. We don't know a whole lot about the effects of IRCs. There's a lot of heterogeneous effects. There are a lot of different sectors that students earn IRCs in. At best, we see really do no harm effects overall from IRCs, which makes it very surprising that Florida and some other states so aggressively promote them. But I think that also presents us with not just that challenge, but also an opportunity to try and figure out, which IRCs really are high value, which ones are really in demand, and which ones do employers care about. And so Florida has about 550 IRCs approved through the Industry Certification Approval Committee that was authorized through the REACH Act. And they also have these gold standard IRCs, or which are the ones that qualify for credit. Skip that. We see very, very aggressive IRC growth over the past decade with a dip during the pandemic, and then in the most recent year, some skyrocketing IRC attempts by students in Florida. And then the industries you might imagine, IT, health sciences, manufacturing, are the most popular and the most prevalent IRCs in the state. On the other hand, we have a lot of variation in pass rates, and so there's definitely a lot to learn from students who just barely pass or just barely fail an IRC. What are their goals? What are they hoping to achieve in the workforce after they earn these credentials? And so to conclude, I think that if we're going to start measuring the effects of small learning communities in Florida and beyond. We need access to Career Academy data, and that means trying to figure out who has an oversubscribed lottery, similar to how we might evaluate charter school impacts. Whole school models are probably the most limited part of CTE in Florida, but there's definitely an opportunity to study them now that we have these charter authorizers at the higher ed level. Florida is very interested, as I mentioned, in tracking trajectories from middle school onward, so I think there are great opportunities to study returns to CTE coursework. And then finally, there's just so much more we need to learn about IRC implementation, especially beyond states like Florida, Georgia, and Texas, where we have our best evidence. We just need more rigorous methods and more detailed data in order to say something tangible about IRCs. So thank you, get in touch, and I must say that we are hiring an assistant professor for pre-K to 12 education policy in Florida, so take a look at that QR code if you're interested. And thank you.
And thank you, Matthew. We're going to go next to Shaun Dougherty. Shaun is a professor of education and policy and the reluctant chair of the Measurement, Evaluation, Statistics, and Assessment Department at Boston College.
Thank you, Greg, for a very accurate assessment of my current circumstances. Shaun Dougherty, I live here in Massachusetts. I am a graduate of public schools and public flagship university, and in this particular private institution as well. And I've been spending the last 15 or so, years doing work with Massachusetts in partnership with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Maybe it's not on. All right, thanks. I used to be a high school teacher, so I could just shout. This doesn't work, but I think this is working. For the last 15 years, in partnership with Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, doing a number of inquiries related to career and technical education in high school and thinking about how that maps into outcomes in high school, post-secondary education, and the workforce. To Greg's prompts, I'll try to make sure that I make the connection between the data that we've been working with that connects to the National Student Clearinghouse, so we have post-secondary enrollment information across most public-private institutions across the nation, as well as unemployment insurance records for some cohorts of high school completers, where we get some level of information for folks who are employed in UI reporting organizations within the state of Massachusetts, being an important caveat. There's been a lot of changes in CTE. There's probably some self-selection into this audience, so I won't say a ton about this, but lots of expansion, in particular, information technology, advanced manufacturing, health services, programs that did not exist by and large 30 years ago in public secondary education with respect to CTE. We've got, as Matt mentioned, some causal evidence in a handful of places where we have oversubscribed schools, but for the most part, the schools that have been oversubscribed are specialized models. They're career academies or they're whole school models of CTE. They're great opportunities to learn about causal impact in those settings, but we don't get a whole lot of information about what happens in more generalizable settings. So comprehensive high schools that offer CTE coursework, career academies that aren't oversubscribed, or like regional part-time programs as exist in, for instance, Pennsylvania, where I was an educator for about a decade, where students split time between their comprehensive high school and part-time centers. So in Massachusetts, we've been trying to learn about both what happens in the specialized school settings and what happens in more generalized settings. My animations are all messed up, but the point of this slide is just to show you over the last 10 years, we've developed a fair amount of evidence that at least includes Massachusetts or is focused specifically in Massachusetts, and a lot of it's in conjunction with Celeste and other colleagues in a multi-state lab that we have, where part of our goal is to make sense of CTE impacts and experiences across states, but I'll let Celeste talk more about that. So why should you care about Massachusetts? Well, it's about 7 million people, about 1 million students at any given point in time. It's reasonably representative of states its size. It's got lower than average, let's say, nationally participation like in terms of concentrators in career and technical education, and above average participation in post-secondary education, but it also has some unique features that I think are worth pointing out. All right, so in this figure, we've got two different school settings. and two different sort of governance structures over career and technical education. So left to right, we have comprehensive high schools. These are like typical, for whatever that means, traditional public high schools where students take all of the state graduation requirements, and they also can take elective coursework in, advanced academics, English language, or world languages, art, music, and then career and technical education. They also have full-time technical high schools that serve students across most districts in the state. That's an important distinction. We've studied more the technical high schools in terms of having strong causal evidence. We have less opportunity to study the comprehensive high schools in terms of strong causal evidence because, as you might imagine, and is quite rational, we do not randomize students to those schools. The second important dimension is that while the federal government requires all CTE programs in order to be eligible for federal funding to meet certain baseline standards for the Carl D. Perkins Act, the state of Massachusetts has an additional statute, Chapter 74 program requirements, that comes with additional requirements and additional funding. So it is an investment, but it's an investment contingent upon meeting requirements like smaller class sizes, tighter connections with post-secondary education, workforce, and labor mediating organizations like workforce investment boards and organized labor, and a strong work-based learning component. As you can see in this figure, it happens in both high school types, right? But these programs are they're different in the statutory requirements and the formalization relative to a lot of other states. And so they also provide an opportunity for us to get more insight into what happens if you have a different set of standards. Do we see differences in outcomes? So that's where the work has been over the last few years for myself and Yaron Yoon, who is a graduate student at Boston College and has been a part central to this work over the last several years. Just want to give you a sense, like macro level, of what's been happening. So there are three trends on these figures. The top trend is just the overall kind of on the left-hand side proportion of schools offering a CTE program. So you see a decline for a period of time, and then it's been fairly stable or weakly growing. And on the right-hand side, it's the average number of programs per school. And I think importantly is that in this quality distinction, when it comes to the Chapter 74 approved programs, that's the darker dashed sequence on there, that has been growing over time. So schools have been adding programs and schools have been substituting away from lower requirements, lower funding levels to higher requirements, higher funding levels over time. And it's been relatively broad-based. So the established programs that I point out here are the things that if you asked folks in this room in 1995, what do you think of when you think of CTE? It's construction trades, transportation, culinary arts, and on the newer programs, it's all of the things that I mentioned earlier that are newer to CTE, that are a large part of our economy as it stands and are considered high growth areas. And the headline is differences in sort of levels, but overall positive trends across these. A unique or a beneficial feature of this work is that we can take the state longitudinal data system for the K-12 system and link it to school clearinghouse and unemployment insurance records. It's not unique to Massachusetts. Many states have the capability and to some extent got grants from the federal government in order to do this, but it is not in broad use. So to themes from the the previous session, I think it's an important opportunity and need when it comes to thinking about understanding the impacts and outcomes for students across a longer time period. So I'm going to skip past these two and just kind of get to what I think the takeaway is. So this is from a paper with Walt Ecton from a few years ago using the Massachusetts data. And what we were doing is mapping out the post-secondary trajectories for students who were and were not in career and technical education, whether or not they were enrolled in college or not. And so I think what's important here are a few things. The yellow trends are for students who, the solid trends are for students who participated in CTE, and the difference between the darker and the lighter color is about whether you went to college or not. The darker colors were students who enrolled in college, and the lighter color are those who did not. by and large, students who are in career and technical education, even across these 5 different clusters that I have up here, were making more money after high school, whether they were in college or not, at least in the short term. Now, once we get to 5 years after high school, we see differences that we should come to expect, or that we might have theorized at the outset, which is students who are enrolled in college, especially if they were full-time getting a 4-year degree, start to see a shift in the steepness of their earnings trajectory, in part because they're in the labor supply to a larger degree, but in part also because we know that there are well-established positive returns to those investments. Not shown on here are differences in debt burden, college costs that are differently absorbed by these 2 groups, but I think this is an example of what's possible in making use of these data sets. You can see that with this paper from a couple years ago, we're only going 7 years after high school completion. It's long enough so that if students were taking 6 years to get through a 4-year degree and there was some convergence happening post-college, it's going to show up here. We see some changes in patterns around the 4 or 5 year mark in ways that are not terribly surprising, but we're in a world where we should be starting to go 10, 15 years past high school using these state longitudinal data systems to answer these questions and making it part of our standard operating procedure. And I'm focusing on career and technical education in this instance because that's part of what I study. I think seriously about the connection between education and the workforce and different educational pathways, but there are opportunities across all emerging school models, and I think an expectation in my mind that we make use of the public investment in these data so that we can look at the long-term outcomes or medium-term outcomes of the investments that we're making. So I'm sure I'm over time, so I'm going to pause right there, but I'm happy to have conversations or be in touch. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And next we have Celeste Carruthers, thank you, who is the William Fox Distinguished Professor of Labor Economics at University of Tennessee.
This is on, great. Nope, should be the PDF. Maybe go over to Acrobat down in the taskbar. Nope, not that one. Carruthers, far left tab. Yeah, they're good. And we can go full screen right on that one. Perfect. Okay, thanks. I wanted to talk about 3 different research papers, a couple that you can find online and one that you will need to kind of follow up with me separately because it's between drafts. Don't be intimidated by the 45 slide count there. I think that would be a professional misconduct in 10 minutes, but a fun challenge that I don't think Greg would like me to take on. So each of these different projects relates to kind of how career and technical education students kind of relate to the workforce in their local area in terms of employment and earnings. And I don't mean their own employment and earnings after high school, but kind of the relationship between the CTE clusters and fields that they select and kind of what the local labor market kind of looks like. So what I'll do is I'll probably skip most of these, but I've been told that all of these slides will be available online. You can dig in further or catch up with me kind of at the receptions and other events. So homework is what I'm giving you. And looking across these 3 different studies, there are kind of a couple findings that I want to highlight up front, just assuming that I'm probably going to run out of time. One, CTE students do tend to choose concentration areas in ways that seem to resemble the local labor market in terms of the industrial composition in their metro or non-metro area, and also in terms of gender differences, kind of which fields young men and young women choose in career and technical education. So that's in kind of a static sense, but in more of a dynamic sense, we don't find in a couple of these studies that CTE enrollments really change very quickly or within 3 or 4 years when the local labor market kind of shifts and changes as well. So taking on that first question of a static versus dynamic alignment, this is a paper with Shaun and other co-authors where it's part of our kind of multi-state career and technical education research group. And we have a number of other studies kind of on this theme where we ask the same question in different kind of states and look for common themes and kind of idiosyncratic patterns across lots of different settings. So this one is on alignment or similarity between career and technical education and workforces. That's important to states, that's important to the federal government, but we don't actually know a lot about alignment, including like why students sort into particular classes, into particular CTE clusters, or even how to like quantify and define and measure alignment changes over time. So that's where the area that we're contributing to. And so we combine state administrative P20W education data from 5 different states, Massachusetts, Michigan, Montana, Tennessee, and Washington. And we match that at the kind of metro, non-metro area to local employment statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And our goal here is to quantify static alignment or similarity between local CTE and local workforces, and then dynamic alignment, like how changes in those two things relate to each other. So here's a brief kind of methods sketch. Imagine a pie chart of CTE concentrators in a local metro, non-metro area, and they're concentrating in one of the 16 different career and technical education clusters that really cover the entire modern economy. And so we're going to correlate those little pie slices to the corresponding aligned pie slice of the local labor market and how the employment is distributed across those different fields. And we find across the 5 settings that we're studying pretty robust evidence of static alignment in that in local areas that, here, this is probably an easier way to see this. So in Detroit, Michigan, for example, the employment composition in the area around Detroit has more in business than in agriculture. Similarly, CTE students are more likely to concentrate in business than in agriculture in Detroit. In Kingsport, Tennessee, there is more, the camera's in the way, there's more health than STEM, is my memory of that table. And likewise, the CTE students are more likely to concentrate in health than STEM in and around Kingsport. We do find some interesting gender dynamics. Women tend to have this steeper rate of static alignment than men, a point I might come back to. But there's just not much evidence of correlated changes in CTE enrollment as a local labor market shifts towards health or towards business or something like that. We don't see the same proportionate increase in kind of student concentration in those areas. So the second kind of paper in this research agenda now shifts from thinking about alignment in terms of employment to alignment in terms of pay. So which students take CTE clusters or kind of focus in CTE cluster areas that lead to potentially higher paying jobs. Again, not their own earnings. We have done that work and we will do it again, but this is kind of thinking about who concentrates in industries that are aligned with some of the higher paying jobs in local areas. Slightly different roster of settings. This time we're looking at Massachusetts, Montana, Tennessee, Washington, and Atlanta metro area. And our key results, kind of 2 headline findings, is that clusters that are associated with higher earning occupations are not consistently more or less popular with students. And we can kind of see that visually here. There's, in Atlanta, for example, there's a pretty flat relationship between potential pay, that's on the vertical axis here, in these different 16 clusters, and the percent of area concentrators that are choosing that particular cluster. Very consistent, with the exception of possibly Montana, which has a small number of clusters, kind of finding across different places. And then the second finding is that women tend to choose clusters with lower potential pay. So there's kind of a negative relationship between the percent of CTE concentrators in a field who are young women and potential pay in those fields. And this is, again, showing Atlanta as an example. Women just tend to be more likely to concentrate in education and training, human services, health. In this figure, it's showing you potential pay without a college degree. And that's results are robust to looking at potential pay with college degree. And that's just demonstrating that kind of women tend to sort into these lower potential paying clusters. And that's very consistent across the different settings that we're studying. There's a lot more in the paper. In interest of time, I'll move ahead to the newer working paper with a former student. So we want to move from this kind of descriptive construct to understand the causal relationships between local labor markets and students' CTE cluster choices. So we're going to focus on Tennessee, and within Tennessee, we're going to focus on manufacturing, career, and technical education. And we collected data on manufacturing workforce and employment in local areas, but also kind of the rate of positive and negative signals about the manufacturing industry in a metro or non-metro area, or in a county even at that final level across Tennessee. So the positive signals we took from subsidized job notices that are maintained and collected by a group called Good Jobs First. And as a negative signal of the manufacturing labor market in an area, we collected notices of large layoffs that states have to report through the WARN Act. Why are we focusing on manufacturing? Well, descriptively, we hadn't seen much relationship between dynamics in the area workforce and the choices that students were making in terms of what they were studying. We think that we're most likely to see something in manufacturing because these manufacturing jobs, a majority of them do not require a college degree, so it's going to be relevant. Local manufacturing jobs and layoffs should be relevant to high school students. The coursework in manufacturing is very aligned with the kind of actual work and skills that are needed in this industry. And there are a lot of positive and negative signals in the manufacturing industry. They kind of dominate the subsidized jobs as well as the layoff notices. We may or may not expect a significant effect of selection into manufacturing, career, and technical education based on what students observe or don't observe in the area labor market. Case for why we might expect a response is that college students behave this way. When there's large layoffs in a field, they are less likely to major in that field. That's a really robust finding across lots of different contexts. Not everyone goes to college, so high school CTE is the place where we might see this behavior for other students. But high school students have less time and credits to work with, and it's not easy for schools to kind of flexibly respond to local labor markets. I'll skip the econometrics and get to the results. Kind of a summary of results. We actually find some really small and modest responsiveness to notices about subsidized jobs in a student's county. Notices from the past year or two is what we have enough data to kind of observe. It's very, very small, though, and it doesn't persist much longer than a couple years. We don't see that students are responsive to notices about layoffs, but when they see that there's a new kind of manufacturing plant in the area, they are a little bit more likely to take a manufacturing class. Okay, and that's where I started, and there's more to come in this research agenda, both from our research group and from Tennessee.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Matthew, you took us through some types of programs. You described the small learning communities, the whole schools, the return to concentration, and the other IRCs and other work. Shaun, you talked to us about the types of schools, whether they were whether they were comprehensive high schools or whether they were CTE only programs, and you did a little bit of showing what the earnings 6-7 years out could be from different types of experiences. And Celeste focused, I heard, mostly on the selection process, looking at the signals given by industries and how that affected the selections of students within those programs. Let me start with you, Celeste. Seems like what you sort of concluded is that there isn't a lot of strong correlations, and it might be like we're looking at baseball and we're looking at what types of concessions are served as a predictor of whether the team's going to win. It seems like what you're saying is that we're just not looking at the things that are actually impacting the career trajectories. That the way that that rational decisions aren't made effectively. So, is there something that you see that would change that? If what we need more nurses, teachers, electricians, advanced manufacturing, how do we actually achieve that, win more games?
Great question, and I should emphasize across these three different papers on kind of workforce alignment and the effect of local workforces on what students choose to study. We're actually kind of reserving some of the normative kind of welfare implications for be future work or for others, where we're trying to understand the extent of responsiveness, if there is any, and kind of how local workforce dynamics kind of affect what students choose to study in high school. But it's possible to have like too much alignment, right? So it's possible for students and schools to be kind of too responsive because the labor market kind of changes and evolves over time. Companies move, new technologies kind of come in, and so if you're perfectly nimble for the class of 2026 and you kind of serve the labor market that they're going to face in 2026 perfectly well, it's not in 2 or 3 years that class of 2026 might be increasingly out of step. But so I didn't answer the question, but to answer the question, what could make school districts and schools and states and their career technical education maybe a little more responsive to the labor market? You probably have to look over a longer time horizon than we do, which across these studies is about maybe 4 years. So that's an important number of years for a high school student, right? And it is a time within which we see college students kind of respond to what's happening in the labor market. So we might see kind of more movement in a longer time horizon. And looking back to kind of a slide where I had kind of a case for no responsiveness, it's just very costly to kind of stand up new programs or to wind down new programs. And those costs are not all bad necessarily, but it's schools have a lot of other resources that they need to contend with and allocate.
Excellent. Thank you. Shaun, for you, can you talk a little bit more about the projection, the income projections, how that data is connected together, and whether what you showed us controls for multi-generational wealth and socioeconomics? Folks earn more if they go to college, but they're obviously more likely to go to college if they come from from a previous college attending family. So how much are we showing a college plus CTE effect, and how much are we just showing again that wealthier families have wealthier kids?
So in our models, we're taking into account all of what we can observe in the data. So we have the broad characterizations of race and gender, really rough proxies for socioeconomic status, and several years of test score data, and to some extent course participation in high school. To the extent that any or all of those collectively are proxies for what these important elements that you're raising, we're adjusting for some of it. But actually, those earnings trajectories I would say are not causal. Those are descriptive, and we can pack a lot more in there, even if they're just conditioning on observables. That said, in other work in Connecticut, where we have specialized high schools that are oversubscribed, and we can look 10 years past high school, similar sort of school setup to the technical high schools in Massachusetts, we can say that at the cutoff, right, where the schools run out of room, similar to the test-based admission schools in Boston and New York, students who just barely got in compared to the students who just missed getting in earn about 30% more after, 7 years after high school. And we can say that those are observationally equivalent individuals. So, those are different answers to different questions. One is about kind of on average, what should we expect about differences in earnings trajectories when we can't perfectly observe differences in, household wealth in addition to income and performance. And then, but the other question that we can answer is, like, in instances where we can take those things and control for them, we do find some convincing evidence of difference.
In Massachusetts, as a quick follow-up, Massachusetts is moving from a admissions-based process for CTE to a randomized process. Is that correct? And does that open up opportunities for you to have more kind of almost randomized control of those who did get in, those didn't get in by lottery?
That's right. So a paper that Matt referenced earlier, I used the oversubscription of the Massachusetts schools to fit a similar model to what we did in Connecticut, but historically in Massachusetts, when I did my dissertation 15 years ago, they did not require that schools report their admissions data. So I just went door to door and talked to schools, and some of them volunteered their data, and so we did this matching exercise. In Connecticut, it's a comprehensive centralized system, so it was more possible. Over the last few years, Massachusetts has moved towards collecting that information centrally and now is adopting a weighted lottery for admission. So yeah, we're already in conversation for how to do a prospective study. Hopefully it'll work out as true lotteries and we'll get a better sense on average if you get into one of these schools, what happens.
Excellent. Matthew, take us now to Florida. And we heard at the session that we just all came from about the growth of vouchers and ESAs and things in Florida. How does that impact the career technical education space that you described?
Ooh, good question. Well, as many folks in this room might know, Florida is kind of ground zero for school choice with the growth of vouchers and ESAs. I think the first order of business is to try to quantify the relationship between school choice growth in non-public school sectors and how that correlates with public school enrollment. I think the general sense we have is that with the growth of charters, private schools, vouchers, ESAs, we've seen a decline in public school enrollment, especially in big counties like Orlando, for instance, where the Daily did a podcast episode about exclusively. Very, very much worth your time. And so how does that affect CTE? I guess, you could infer from that if public school enrollment is declining, then CTE participation in public schools might also be declining. And so that brings us to some of the components of Florida policy and legislation, which is seeking to implement CTE in non-public school choice settings, such as charters and such as private schools. So I think we just have to watch really closely the extent to which CTE opportunities are state subsidized, the extent to which IRCs and our articulation agreements grow. I think that'll help us get a firmer understanding about what this trade-off is going to be enrollment-wise.
Okay, excellent. So now we're going to open it up to the audience. Let me bring this over to you.
Thanks. So as school choice spread, it has plenty of critics. And critics ask questions about what types of kids are using the school choice programs, or they ask about civic participation and what sort of impacts it has on voting behavior or all sorts of other things. I don't hear a lot of criticism of CTE. I see mostly from, I think, Democrats and Republicans generally support. But I'm curious, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I don't see the criticism and you do, but have there been studies looking at some of these other things? Is it that lower income families tend to track into these programs, maybe to the detriment of college-going rates? Is it that it could lead to a decrease in civic participation or civic knowledge or any of those sorts of things? Have we had studies on those sorts of things?
So I'll just address what would otherwise be the elephant in the room. In Massachusetts, to Greg's question about moving to lottery-based admissions, it's been highly contested for probably a decade now, the fact that there's such high demand for technical high schools in Massachusetts and fewer seats than can accommodate the students who would like to attend those schools. And it's especially acute in areas like gateway cities, areas with high concentrations of recent immigrants or lower income families. And so there's been arguments on both sides, one advocating both for the popularity because it's such high quality, but then also people making arguments about equity and does a merit-based system of admissions, is that really creating opportunity for everybody? When people aren't critiquing that specifically in Massachusetts, I think the critique is on are kids selecting out of higher paying four-year college pathways. I think it's the right question to ask because we don't want to revisit a tracking system de facto tracking system that existed in the 80s and 90s, where students based on their income or based on their race or other perceptions of class were getting pushed into lower income tracks, right? Like for CTE. That said, the counterfactual for all kids is not going to a small liberal arts college and making $85,000 in iBanking, right? And so I think that thinking seriously about what you want to do, what's going to get you to where you want to go, and is that going to pay a reasonable wage, I think that's sort of my pushback on some of the critique, but that's generally the critique, is that people might be substituting away from higher wage or more adaptable alternatives into a kind of narrower pathway.
I guess I'll just add to that, like one feature of being able to work with Shaun and other co-authors to kind of study CTE and CTE students across lots of different contexts is we're able to kind of pick up on strong patterns, sort of like the kind of gender selection into different fields, but also areas where there's not really a strong pattern. And looking across states, my memory of close to 10 years of research in our multi-state research group is that we don't see like student achievement measures diverge really widely for CTE and non-CTE students, conditional on them getting far enough to have possibly concentrated in CTE, say 12th grade or so. We see CTE students tend to be a little bit less likely to go on to college, but among students who are not going to college, they tend to make a little bit more in the workforce shortly after high school. But these are also not like profoundly large differences, and they vary a bit by context. So at least quantitatively, it doesn't seem like we're in the similar to the past where there was this strong tracking into what was called vocational education then.
And Shaun and Celeste, my perception in Massachusetts is that the negative stigma to CTE has now given way to a positive halo, that there's both MCAS data and perception, and then actual hard data that shows that students going to the CTE schools are actually outperform their sending districts academically. Is that, and I don't know whether that's true in the other states that you've studied together.
Yeah, so it's certainly in Massachusetts that tends to be, like, even if we account for some of the self-interest in how sometimes that information is reported by individual schools, that tends to be true on average. If we compare students who were similar when they entered high school, the technical high schools and the Chapter 74 programs are producing good outcomes.
Yeah, that tracks. I'm thinking of other research kind of outside of our group showing like a causal positive effects on high school graduation for having taken more CTE.
Hi, my name is Mike Porcelli. I teach automotive at the City University of New York, and I write a newspaper column on CTE. So I'm very interested in all these studies. But can you address the statistic that says the college graduate makes $1 million over lifetime more than a non-college graduate? I say if you take someone who's a CTE grad who has years of certifications. For example, I have hundreds of automotive certifications. I also have a master's degree. Now, my income would be counted as somebody with a master's degree, not somebody with trade certification. If you take somebody with trade certifications, an equal number of years, say, to get 100 trade certifications, it might be more than it takes the number of years to get a master's degree. The kids I teach, inner city kids in New York City, they have the potential to make more money than most of the teachers at this institution. I have cases and cases of people making $200,000 to $300,000 a year fixing cars, and most of them have no college education. They might have community college. I teach at community college. At most, they might have community college, but they have many, many trade certifications. Has anybody looked into that disparity?
I can take on at least part of that because I'm responsible for kind of one of the white papers behind the kind of $1 million additional lifetime earnings from college. I'm not the only one who's put this together. This was a report that we were asked to do in 2022 when the labor market was really, really tight and earnings were going up even faster than inflation for people without a college education because there were just more job openings than job seekers, a lot more job openings. And so there were just questions coming back around about the value of college, and we took a serious look at that. And using the latest available data, found the kind of same pattern that people with a bachelor's degree is what leads to that $1 million or higher lifetime earnings. An associate's degree, which might include a lot of those certificates and certifications along the way, was about $400,000 in additional lifetime earnings over a high school degree. But in looking at that literature, something that also became like really, really apparent was that that's the average return, and there's a wide variance of outcomes around that average. And others have shown that even if college was tuition free, it wouldn't pay off in strictly financial terms for a really large percentage of students. I want to say like about 25% is the statistic that comes to mind. And that's because there's a wide variation in returns to college, but there's also a wide variation in what you can do with a high school diploma and additional kind of training after high school.
And I'll just add, we have not used necessarily the available data, let's say in the United States, to compare like earnings trajectories of people with trade certifications or who've done a formal apprenticeship over the full working lifetime. Previous studies that used international data suggested that on average, the folks with a BA or higher, that differential, whether it's $1 million or a smaller figure, that like the overall benefit would be larger from a college degree than from a skilled trade. That's data that's more than 30 years old now, and there's more recent data from Finland. Mikko Silliman and Hanna Virtanen showed that in oversubscribed technical schools, basically, even though at a certain point college graduates make more money than the non-college grads who went to the technical school, across the lifetime and accounting for college costs, they break even or come ahead. And so I think to Celeste's point about the variation in returns, both for college graduates and for non-college or people who do not pursue a college pathway, I think some closer analysis and more detail in the U.S. data analysis would be beneficial.
Just anecdotally, you think about young people that we all know, and we all know plenty of young people who have graduated from college and go to work at a Starbucks or a restaurant, right? You would expect that far fewer with those types of certifications are going to be in those types of lower end jobs.
Let me just follow up one thing. My newspaper column is called The Other Side of Education. There's the academic side and the trade side. To me, the ideal situation is what I call the best of both worlds, college degrees and trade certifications, like I have. Has anybody studied people with multiple college degrees and multiple trade certifications?
Shaun, that's what you showed us, right? A little bit of those graphs.
There I wasn't accounting for the possible overlap between the two. I've not. We have looked at people who are both enrolled in college and working, but we have not had enough years of follow-up data yet to really to look at the accumulation of both.
You're hitting at one of the biggest questions in economics, which is how to disentangle human capital from signals. And so it's really hard to know if any earnings return is coming from the human capital, which is the years spent in school and the degree, or the signal that may come from any number of certifications. So this is a question we all struggle trying to answer. But with better data and better what we call identification, I think we can get there.
I'll expect the answer next year.
You got it.
Hi, I'm Rhonda from Florida, and my question is, when you're looking at students and that pass-fail rate, are those students that are in high school taking these technical courses, trying to get certifications when they graduate high school with a certification, or are these primarily students that have graduated from high school and are now taking those certification routes?
No, these are high schoolers only, yeah. So, post-secondary CTE is a whole different set of analyses that we should be thinking about, especially the pathway from high school to college and articulation and who gets credit for what. What's really interesting and also shocking is the extent to which certifications are proliferating in the high school setting. And so we want to get a better understanding of what the opportunity cost might be for students studying for and earning these certifications, the extent to which a capstone certification really relates to the CTE pathway. And so you raise a really important question about post-secondary CTE, but those were just the districts and counties in which high school students resided.
Hi, this is Christy Wolf from the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. I have a question from the perspective of policy and what you would say to policymakers that are interested in having the best of these examples that you've talked about on the best research encouraged especially through federal policy, and if you have any suggestions about guardrails, do you think Perkins is worth continuing as a separate funding stream, or is that an obstacle to integrating these comprehensive high schools, technical education in a rigorous academic environment? So would love your thoughts on policy.
I think we'll end on this also, so if the three of you could each address kind of the federal perspective.
You both know more about Perkins than I. Shaun wrote an article about the history of CTE, which really gave us a lot on Perkins. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's all right. This is something I continue to wrestle with. If we were to continue with Perkins in its like something similar to its current form, I would like to see better or different reporting requirements than what we require now. Right now, it feels totally unfettered, and I'm not entirely convinced that it's being spent in similarly productive ways across states. So I think if we had higher expectations for what we knew we were getting in terms of return on our investment, where the money was going, how states are justifying what's considered, for instance, under the current language, high wage, high skill, or high demand. I think we could have a greater degree of confidence that it was being put to good use. That said, it's the minority of total funding expenditure on CTE in most states, especially states like Tennessee that have like twice the concentration rate that Massachusetts has. And so I think we'd have to think about the relative value maybe differently across state settings. And then, yeah, the other dimension that I'll note with Perkins is that in the last reauthorization, in addition to not defining high skill, high demand, or high wage, we reduced the total number of courses you need to be a concentrator to 2 from 3. On the one hand, that might help states get more money to make larger investments in the future of their CTE program. So for instance, if you only had 2 courses, but now you get more money because you have more concentrators. Sorry, I'm in the weeds for those of you who don't know Perkins. That might help you add a 3rd class, right? But we know enough from the course returns to coursework and pathway completion to suggest that it's probably more than 2 courses we need to really get students the skills that are going to pay off in the workforce. And so that's another place where I'd like to see, it's not necessarily more regulation, but if we could set a higher bar for in the accountability space with respect to CTE investments, I think it'd be to our economic and educational benefit, I suspect.
Wow, big question. Lots of thoughts on that. I can probably ramble on for quite a long time. I think I want to speak a little bit about maybe state and federal policy, or just district, local, state, federal policy around career and technical education in general. It is something that has bipartisan support, but beyond that, career and technical education has a lot of support among parents, among the public, among students. They like active learning. They like project-based learning, work-based learning, applied learning. They like kind of learning new skills and knowledge that they can actually see how is applied in real jobs and careers, whether or not they ultimately go on to those careers. And I think there's a big enough body of research on modern day career and technical education in the modern day economy that we can more than tentatively conclude that like more high quality career and technical education would be to students' benefit today. And if we're concerned about future technological developments, including AI, I mean that's just a new technology, and like we have a whole subsector of education that's been adjusting to technology and learning how to use and deploy technology for a long time. Shifting gears a little bit, but still very much in the policy sphere. There's a lot more that we need to understand from research, including kind of long-term returns to career and technical education and different forms of that, because we're from lots of different states here, and I'm sure that we recognize there are lots of different ways to deliver and fund career and technical education. The research that many of us were kind of talking about relies very heavily on kind of state longitudinal data systems that allow us to kind of identify higher education and workforce outcomes, but within a particular state. And so it's really, I'm from Tennessee, we have some big metro areas right on the borders, and we kind of don't really see when students come to Tennessee from the borders or when they kind of leave. So this is an area where actually the federal government can help us on the kind of data and research side.
Perfect. We're pretty much out of time, but Matthew, if you'd like any final words?
No, we're at time, and Shaun and Celeste nailed it, so that's great.
Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, our panelists. My understanding is there's a 15-minute break, and then the next set of panels will start in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Dirty jobs, micro.
Yeah.
You know his latest slogan is, we need philosophy as well. That's what I, okay? Now, and my comment last month, he could propose